My mom said, "You're not welcome at your sister's wedding." And that was just the beginning. My name is Emily. I'm 31 years old, and I live in a small town in Ohio where everyone knows everyone else's business. I work as a marketing coordinator at a local company, and I've always been the responsible one in my family. You know the type. The oldest daughter who steps in when things fall apart, who remembers everyone's birthdays, who gets called when there's a crisis. That's me. I have a younger sister named Sophie who's 28, and growing up, we were inseparable. While our mom Karen was busy maintaining her image as the perfect suburban mother, I was the one actually raising Sophie. I helped her with homework, took her to soccer practice when mom was too busy with her book club, and stayed up late comforting her when she had nightmares. Sophie was my little shadow, and I loved being her big sister. Our family dynamic was always a bit complicated. Mom has this way of making everything about appearances. She's the type who volunteers for every charity event, not because she cares, but because it looks good. Dad, David, is the complete opposite. He avoids conflict at all costs and just goes along with whatever mom decides. He's a good man, but he's never been one to rock the boat. When Sophie got engaged to her college boyfriend last spring, I was over the moon. I literally cried when she called to tell me the news. We spent hours on the phone talking about wedding plans, and when she asked me to be her maid of honor, I felt like my heart might burst with pride. This was going to be our moment, the culmination of all those years of sisterhood. I threw myself into wedding planning with the enthusiasm of someone planning their own wedding. I researched venues, created Pinterest boards, and spent my weekends driving to different locations with Sophie. When we found this beautiful historic mansion about an hour outside of town, Sophie fell in love with it immediately. The only problem was the price. It was way over their budget. Without hesitation, I offered to cover the difference. It was about $3,000, but seeing Sophie's face light up made it worth every penny. That should have been my first warning sign. Not that I was being generous, but how quickly Mom inserted herself into the situation. The next day, she called the venue herself to handle the details and somehow became the primary contact. Suddenly, all the communication was going through her instead of Sophie or me. But I brushed it off. Mom likes to be involved, I told myself. She wants Sophie's wedding to be perfect too. The cake was the next thing. Sophie and I had spent an entire Saturday at different bakeries, tasting samples and laughing until our stomachs hurt. We found this amazing baker who specialized in vintage-style cakes, and Sophie was obsessed with this 3-tier design with delicate sugar flowers. The price was steep, $1,200. But again, I didn't hesitate. I put down the deposit that same day. Mom seemed pleased when I told her about the cake, but there was something in her expression I couldn't quite read. Looking back now, I think it was the moment she realized I was becoming too central to the wedding planning. In her mind, that was her role. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing small changes. Phone calls between Sophie and me became shorter. When I'd suggest meeting up to work on wedding stuff, she'd say she was busy or that Mom had already handled whatever I wanted to discuss. I figured she was just stressed. Planning a wedding is overwhelming, and maybe having Mom take care of some things was actually helpful. Then there was the dress shopping incident. Sophie and I had planned for months to make a day of it, just the two of us, like we'd dreamed about since we were kids. We were going to drive to the city, hit the bridal stores, and then celebrate with dinner at our favorite restaurant. I had even taken the day off work. The morning of our planned trip, Sophie texted me to cancel. She said Mom had surprised her with appointments at different stores, and they were leaving in an hour. I was hurt, but I tried to be understanding. Maybe Mom wanted to have her own special moment with Sophie. I could respect that. But when I saw the photos on social media later that day, Sophie in a gorgeous gown, Mom crying happy tears, and notably, absent was any mention that this was supposed to be our day, something in my chest tightened. And there was someone else in the photos I didn't recognize. A woman about my age, blonde, always positioned right next to Sophie in the shots. I asked Sophie about it later, and she mentioned it was our cousin Claire, Mom's sister's daughter. I barely knew Claire. She lived across the country and we maybe saw her at Christmas every few years. But apparently, she had moved back to Ohio recently, and Mom thought it would be nice to include her in the wedding activities. That's when the exclusions started becoming more obvious. The cake tasting I wasn't invited to. The flower arranging session I found out about through Mom's Facebook posts. The bridal shower planning meetings that somehow happened without me. Every time I asked Sophie about it, she'd give me vague answers about how things just came together spontaneously, or how she didn't want to bother me since I was so busy with work. But I wasn't too busy. I had specifically been keeping my schedule light so I could be available for wedding stuff. I started feeling like I was watching my sister's wedding planning from the outside, like a stranger looking through a window at a party I wasn't invited to. The breaking point came 6 weeks before the wedding. I had been working on a surprise. For Sophie, I had secretly been in touch with Tyler, my boyfriend, about planning and paying for Sophie and her fiancé's honeymoon. It was going to be my wedding gift to them. A week in Hawaii, at a resort I knew Sophie had always dreamed of visiting. The total cost was $6,000, which was a significant chunk of my savings, but Sophie was worth it. I was so excited about the surprise that I could barely contain myself. I had all the resort brochures hidden in my apartment, and I'd even started looking at activities they could do there. I was planning to tell her about it at what I thought was going to be our next planning session. But that session never happened. Instead, I got a call from Mom, asking if I could come over for a family meeting that evening. She said there were some things about the wedding that needed to be discussed, and it would be better to handle them all at once. I should have known something was wrong by the formal way she phrased it. Mom doesn't call family meetings unless someone is in trouble, or there's bad news to deliver. But I was so focused on wanting to share the honeymoon surprise that I didn't pick up on the warning signs. When I arrived at my parents' house that evening, the scene was set like some kind of intervention. Mom and Dad were sitting on the couch. Sophie was in the armchair looking like she wanted to disappear, and Claire was there too, which immediately struck me as odd. Why would Claire be at a family meeting about Sophie's wedding? Mom started talking before I even sat down. She said they'd all been discussing the wedding planning process, and some concerns had come up. She used that tone she always uses when she's about to deliver bad news but wants to sound like she's being reasonable about it. The concerns, she explained, were about my involvement in the wedding. Several people had commented that I seemed to be taking over, trying to make the wedding about me instead of about Sophie. She said I was using my financial contributions to control decisions and make Sophie feel obligated to include me in everything. Was stunned. I asked who had said these things, because none of it sounded like anything Sophie would think, let alone say. Sophie wouldn't even look at me. She just sat there staring at her hands while Mom continued her speech. Mom said they had all discussed it as a family, and they had decided it would be best if I stepped back from my role as maid of honor. Claire had graciously agreed to step in since she was family and had been so helpful with the recent planning activities. They thought this would eliminate any tension and allow everyone to just focus on celebrating Sophie's big day. I looked at Sophie, waiting for her to say something, to defend me, to tell Mom this was crazy, but she remained silent. When I directly asked her if this was what she wanted, she finally looked up and said, very quietly, that maybe it would be less stressful for everyone this way. Less stressful. Those words hit me like a physical blow. I had bent over backward to make this wedding planning process as smooth and joyful as possible. I had contributed thousands of dollars without being asked, spent countless hours researching and organizing, and rearranged my entire schedule to be available whenever Sophie needed me. And somehow, I had become the source of stress. But Mom wasn't done. She said that given how emotional I seemed to be getting about the changes, maybe it would be better if I didn't attend the wedding at all. She said she was worried that my presence would create drama or make Sophie feel guilty, and the last thing anyone wanted was for the bride to be upset on her wedding day. That's when she said the words that will be burned into my memory forever. "You're not welcome at your sister's wedding." I sat there for a moment, trying to process what I had just heard. My own mother had just uninvited me from my sister's wedding. My sister, who I had helped raise, who I had supported through every major moment of her life, was going to get married without me there. I looked around the room at these people who were supposed to be my family. Dad wouldn't meet my eyes. Sophie was crying now, but she still wasn't saying anything to defend me. Claire looked uncomfortable, but didn't speak up. And Mom just sat there with this satisfied expression, like she had successfully resolved a problem. I stood up and walked toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I turned back and told them that since I apparently wasn't family anymore, I would be removing my financial contributions from the wedding. The venue deposit, the cake, the flowers I had secretly already paid for, and especially the honeymoon that I had spent weeks planning as a surprise. Sophie's head snapped up at that. "What honeymoon?" she asked. I told her about the $6,000 trip to Hawaii that I had booked as my wedding gift to her. I had all the confirmation numbers in my phone, and the resort booking was under my credit card. Since I was no longer welcome at the wedding, I explained, I would be canceling everything and using that money for a vacation of my own. The room went completely silent. I think for the first time, they realized exactly how much I had been contributing to this wedding, and how serious I was about removing that support. I left without another word. When I got home, I immediately called the resort and canceled the honeymoon booking. There was a cancellation fee, but I got most of the money back. I called the florist and canceled the upgraded flower arrangements I had secretly added to Sophie's order. I contacted the venue and had my name removed from the deposit, which created some complications since I had been listed as a responsible party for payment. The cake was trickier because it was a specialty order, but the baker was understanding. When I explained the situation, she agreed to modify the order to a smaller, less expensive option, and refunded me the difference. Over the next few days, I waited for someone to call me. I thought surely Sophie would reach out once she realized what had happened, once she understood how much I had been quietly contributing to make her day special. I thought maybe Dad would call to try to smooth things over, or that Mom would realize she had gone too far. But my phone stayed silent. A week later, my coworker Jessica mentioned that she had seen photos of Sophie's bridal shower on social media. I hadn't even known there was a bridal shower. When I looked at the photos later that night, I saw Sophie surrounded by all our female relatives and family friends, with Claire prominently featured as the maid of honor, opening gifts and laughing. There was no mention of me anywhere, like I had been completely erased from Sophie's life. That's when it really hit me. This wasn't just about the wedding. This was about Mom systematically pushing me out and replacing me with Claire, someone she could control and who wouldn't challenge her authority. And Sophie had let it happen. 2 weeks before the wedding, I finally heard from someone in my family. But it wasn't Sophie or Dad calling to apologize. It was Mom, and she was furious. She had apparently just found out about all the things I had canceled, and the wedding budget was in crisis. The venue was demanding additional payment since my deposit had been removed. The cake had been downgraded to something much smaller and simpler. The flowers were basic instead of the elaborate arrangements Sophie had been expecting. Mom demanded that I restore all the payments immediately. She said I was being petty and vindictive, and that I was trying to ruin Sophie's wedding out of spite. She actually used the phrase emotional blackmail to describe what I was doing. I told her that since I wasn't welcome at the wedding, my money wasn't welcome either. If they wanted the upgraded cake and flowers and venue deposits, they were free to pay for those things themselves. That's what families do for each other, right? And since I was apparently not family anymore, it wasn't my responsibility. Mom hung up on me. The next day, she showed up at my workplace. I work in a small, office, and Mom came storming in during the middle of the afternoon, demanding to speak with me. When my boss asked if everything was okay, Mom announced loudly that I was having some kind of mental breakdown and was trying to destroy my sister's wedding. The whole scene was mortifying. My coworkers were staring. My boss looked concerned, and Mom was practically screaming about how I was being selfish and cruel. Security eventually had to escort her out of the building, but not before she had made it clear to everyone I worked with that there was some kind of family drama happening. Was so embarrassed I could barely function for the rest of the day. My boss, thankfully, was understanding when I explained that there was a family conflict happening, and that Mom's behavior didn't represent how I normally handle problems. But I could tell that some of my coworkers were looking at me differently, wondering what kind of person would cause their mother to have a public meltdown. That evening, Tyler came over and found me crying on my couch. He had been incredibly supportive through this whole situation, but I could tell he was struggling to understand how a family could implode so completely over a wedding. He held me while I sobbed and told him about Mom's scene at work and how humiliated I felt. Tyler suggested that maybe I should try reaching out to Sophie directly, bypassing Mom entirely. He thought maybe Sophie didn't fully understand what was happening, or that she was being pressured by Mom and didn't know how to stand up for me. So I swallowed my pride and called Sophie. When she answered, her voice was cold in a way I had never heard before. I tried to explain my side of the story, to tell her how hurt I was and how much I missed her. I told her about the honeymoon I had planned, about all the little details I had been taking care of behind the scenes to make her day special. Sophie listened, but when I finished talking, she said something that broke my heart completely. She said that Mom had shown her text messages I had supposedly sent, complaining about the wedding costs and calling Sophie spoiled and demanding. She said there were emails where I had apparently criticized her fiancé and suggested that they weren't ready for marriage. I was confused because I had never sent any messages like that. I asked Sophie to forward them to me so I could see what she was talking about. When she did, I realized immediately what had happened. The messages were fake. They were created using a text generator app, designed to look like they came from my phone number, but they contained language and phrases I would never use. Someone had gone to significant trouble to create fake evidence that I was being unsupportive and manipulative, and there was only one person with both the motivation and the technical knowledge to pull something like this off. Mom had enlisted someone to help her create fake messages to turn Sophie against me. I spent the next hour on the phone with Sophie, going through the fake messages point by point, explaining why each one was obviously not from me. I showed her my actual text history, which contained nothing but supportive messages about the wedding. I even offered to take my phone to a specialist who could verify that these messages hadn't originated from my device. Sophie was quiet for a long time after I finished explaining. Finally, she said she needed to think about everything and would call me back. But she never did. 3 days before the wedding, I got a call from Dad. It was the first time I had heard from him since the family meeting, and his voice sounded tired and defeated. He said he wanted me to know that he didn't agree with what had happened, but that he didn't know how to fix it without making things worse. He told me that the wedding preparations were in chaos. Without my financial contributions, they were scrambling to cover costs and had to downgrade several elements of the celebration. Mom was stressed and taking it out on everyone around her. Sophie was barely speaking to anyone and seemed miserable about the whole situation. Dad asked if there was any way I would consider coming back. Maybe not as maid of honor, but just as a guest. He said Sophie needed me there, even if she couldn't bring herself to ask for it directly. I told Dad that I appreciated him reaching out, but that the damage had been done. Mom had made it clear that I wasn't welcome, and Sophie had chosen to stay silent when she could have stood up for me. I wasn't going to put myself in a position to be humiliated or rejected again. The night before the wedding, Tyler and I went out to dinner at a nice restaurant across town. I had taken the day off work originally to help with last-minute wedding preparations, and I didn't want to spend it sitting at home feeling sorry for myself. We had a lovely evening, and I tried not to think about the fact that my sister was getting married the next day without me. But around 10 p.m., my phone started ringing. It was Sophie. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. When she finally calmed down enough to speak clearly, she told me that she had confronted Mom about the fake text messages. She had demanded to see Mom's phone and discovered not just the app that had been used to create the fake messages, but also a whole folder of screenshots and notes about how to manage the Emily situation. Mom had been planning this for weeks. She had been systematically working to push me out of the wedding and replace me with Claire, who she felt would be more grateful and easier to control. The fake messages were just one part of a larger campaign to turn Sophie against me and justify my exclusion. Sophie was devastated. She said she felt like she didn't even know who our mother was anymore, and that she was horrified by the lengths Mom had gone to manipulate the situation. She begged me to come to the wedding, said she would tell everyone that I was the real maid of honor and that Claire could step aside. But it was too late. The wedding was the next morning, and I had already made peace with not being there. More than that, I realized that even if I went, the underlying problems in our family wouldn't be resolved. Mom would still be the same manipulative person she had always been, and Sophie had still chosen to believe the worst about me without giving me a chance to defend myself. I told Sophie that I loved her, and I hoped she had a beautiful wedding day, but that I wouldn't be attending. I said that maybe after she got back from her honeymoon, we could sit down and talk about how to rebuild our relationship, but that it would have to be separate from the rest of the family drama. Sophie cried harder and begged me to reconsider, but I had made my decision. I hung up and turned off my phone for the rest of the night. The next morning, while my sister was getting married, I went hiking with Tyler. We drove up to a state park about 2 hours away and spent the day walking, trails and talking about everything except the wedding. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in months, and I realized that I wasn't as devastated as I had expected to be. That evening, when we got back to town, I turned my phone back on to find dozens of missed calls and text messages. Apparently, the wedding had been a disaster. Sophie had been so upset about our conversation the night before that she could barely get through the ceremony. She kept crying during her vows. Not tears of joy, but tears of sadness about the family rift. Mom had apparently spent the entire reception trying to manage the optics of my absence, making excuses to relatives about why the maid of honor wasn't the bride's sister. Several family members had asked pointed questions about where I was, and the whole thing had created an undercurrent of tension throughout the celebration. But the most dramatic part came during the reception speeches. Claire, as the replacement maid of honor, was supposed to give a toast about Sophie, but instead of the typical sweet speech about childhood memories and friendship, Claire apparently used the opportunity to publicly call out Mom's behavior. She told the entire wedding reception that she had been uncomfortable with her role in pushing me out of the wedding, and that she wanted everyone to know that I had been the one who had contributed most significantly to making the day possible. She listed off the things I had paid for, the work I had done, and the ways I had supported Sophie throughout the engagement. Then she said that the real maid of honor should have been Sophie's sister, and that she was ashamed to have been part of a plan to exclude me. She ended her speech by raising her glass to me, even though I wasn't there, and thanking me for my generosity and love. The reception apparently went completely silent after that. Mom was furious, Sophie was sobbing, and several relatives started demanding explanations about what had really happened and why I wasn't there. The aftermath of the wedding was swift and dramatic. Within a week, I had received apology calls from several aunts and uncles who had heard Claire's speech and wanted to understand the full story. Our extended family was divided, with some people taking Mom's side and others supporting me. Sophie called me every day for 2 weeks, begging me to meet with her so she could apologize properly. She said her honeymoon had been ruined because she couldn't stop thinking about how badly she had treated me, and that she wanted to make things right. Finally agreed to meet her for coffee, just the two of us, 3 weeks after the wedding. She looked exhausted and sad, and she immediately started crying when she saw me. She apologized over and over, saying she didn't know how she had let Mom manipulate her so completely, and that she was horrified by her own behavior. Sophie told me that she was going to therapy to work through the family dynamics and to understand how she had been so easily manipulated. She said she realized that she had always been afraid of disappointing Mom, and that fear had made her weak when she should have been strong. She also told me that she was considering going no contact with Mom for a while, to give herself space, to figure out how to have a relationship with her that didn't involve manipulation and control. She said Claire's speech had been a wake-up call about how toxic the situation had become. I appreciated Sophie's apology, and I could see that she was genuinely remorseful. But I also realized that our relationship had been fundamentally changed by what had happened. The sister who I thought would always have my back had chosen to stay silent when I needed her most. That's not something you just bounce back from overnight. We agreed to take things slowly. Sophie would continue with therapy, and we would have regular coffee dates to rebuild our trust gradually. I made it clear that any relationship we had going forward would need to be separate from Mom, at least until Mom acknowledged what she had done and made genuine amends. As for Mom, she never apologized. In fact, she doubled down on her position, that she had been protecting Sophie from my controlling behavior. She told relatives that I was being overdramatic and that the whole situation had been blown out of proportion. The extended family response was interesting. Several of my aunts reached out to tell me that they had always found Mom's behavior problematic, but had never felt comfortable speaking up. They said watching what happened with the wedding had given them permission to acknowledge patterns they had been ignoring for years. My relationship with Dad improved somewhat. He admitted that he should have stood up for me during the family meeting, and that his conflict avoidance had enabled Mom's manipulative behavior. He said he was working on being more assertive in his marriage and more supportive of his daughters. The whole experience taught me something important about family loyalty and boundaries. I had always believed that family meant unconditional support, that you stood by each other no matter what. But I learned that sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is step away from toxic dynamics, even when they involve people you love. I also learned that financial generosity doesn't buy you love or loyalty. I had been using money as a way to show care and to secure my place in family events. But that approach had actually made me vulnerable to manipulation. People who genuinely care about you don't need to be paid to include you, and people who exclude you weren't really valuing you in the first place. 6 months after the wedding, Sophie and I have rebuilt a cautious friendship. We see each other regularly, but always just the two of us. And we don't discuss Mom unless Sophie brings her up in the context of her therapy work. Sophie has maintained limited contact with Mom and has set clear boundaries about manipulation and control. Claire and I actually became friends through this whole ordeal. Her speech at the wedding had taken real courage, and I respected her for putting integrity above family politics. She told me later that she had been uncomfortable with the whole situation from the beginning, but hadn't known how to get out of it without causing more drama. Tyler and I got engaged 6 months later. When we start planning our wedding, we've already decided that we'll be paying for everything ourselves, and that we'll keep the guest list small and the planning process simple. I'm not interested in creating opportunities for family drama or manipulation. The most surprising outcome of all this was how liberating it felt to stop being the family fixer. For my entire adult life, I had been the one who smoothed over conflicts, who contributed financially to family events, who made sure everyone else was happy even when it came at my own expense. Being pushed out of that role was initially devastating, but ultimately it freed me to focus on my own life and happiness. I still love my family, but I love them differently now. I love them with boundaries. I love them with clear expectations about how I'm willing to be treated. And I love them with the understanding that sometimes love means walking away from situations that are harmful to your mental health and self-respect. The hardest part of the whole experience was learning that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally sometimes don't. But the most valuable part was discovering that you can survive that disappointment and build a better life on the other side of it. If someone had told me a year ago that I would be uninvited from my sister's wedding by my own mother, I would have said that was impossible. Our family wasn't perfect, but we weren't the kind of people who cut each other off over disagreements. But I learned that every family is capable of dysfunction when the right pressures and personalities collide. I also learned that you can't control other people's choices, but you can control how you respond to them. I could have begged and pleaded and compromised my self-respect to try to get back into the wedding. Instead, I chose to maintain my dignity and walk away from a situation where I wasn't valued. That choice cost me something. I missed my sister's wedding, and I lost the illusion that my family was as solid and supportive as I had believed. But it also gave me something invaluable, the knowledge that I can stand up for myself, even when it's difficult, and that I deserve to be treated with respect by the people who claim to love me. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their bad behavior by removing yourself from the situation. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to choose peace over drama, even when that choice comes with a price. I was banned from my sister's wedding, then begged to come back when the family realized how much they had relied on my contributions. But by then, I had already started building a life that didn't depend on their approval or inclusion. And that, more than any wedding or family gathering, turned out to be the real celebration.